The warning klaxon screamed through the Galactic Council chambers as something impossible materialized in the heart of their most secure space station. Where moments before there had been empty void, now hung a ship that defied every law of physics. The galaxy's greatest minds had spent millennia establishing that it wasn't just any ship. It was the Wanderer's Hope, a human exploration vessel that had vanished into the deep dark 7 years ago, presumed destroyed along with its single occupant, Scout Commander Jake Morrison. The ship's hull gleamed with an otherworldly luminescence that made seasoned alien warriors step back in awe and terror. But that wasn't the impossible part. The impossible part was what followed behind it, a procession stretched beyond the visual horizon, thousands upon thousands of vessels representing civilizations that shouldn't exist. Ships crafted from crystallized starlight sailed alongside others that seemed to phase in and out of reality itself. Massive arc ships the size of moons drifted peacefully next to sleek fighters that left trails of aurora in their wake. Each vessel bore markings and designs that the Council's xenobiologists had never cataloged, never imagined, never dreamed possible. High Chancellor Vex of the Dominion Council stood frozen at the observation deck, his forearms trembling as he processed what his sensors were telling him. His silver-scaled hide had gone pale, and his usually commanding voice cracked when he finally spoke. "How many?" he whispered to his aide. "Initial scans suggest ... million, sir. The fleet extends beyond our sensor range. We've counted over 300 distinct technological signatures, representing species we've never encountered." The Wanderer's Hope broke from the formation and approached the station with movements so smooth they seemed choreographed by the cosmos itself. As it drew closer, the ship's communication array crackled to life, broadcasting on frequencies that hadn't been used in the known galaxy for over a century. "Galactic Council, this is Scout Commander Jake Morrison aboard the Wanderer's Hope, requesting permission to dock. I have quite a story to tell." Chancellor Vex nearly collapsed. The human's voice carried something that hadn't been there 7 years ago, an authority that seemed to resonate with the fabric of space itself. When Jake Morrison had departed on his deep space reconnaissance mission, he had been just another human explorer, brave but unremarkable by galactic standards. Now his voice carried the weight of stars. "Commander Morrison," Vex managed, his diplomatic training barely keeping his composure intact. "You've been declared dead. Your ship was lost in the deep dark. How are you here? And what?" He gestured helplessly at the impossible fleet. "What is all of this?" Jake's laugh came through. "The come, rich with experiences that spanned cosmic distances. That's a long story, Chancellor, but the short version. I went looking for the edge of the universe. Instead, I found the universe looking for us. Every great bond starts with a single moment of courage. HFY Chronicle Stories is just beginning, and your support matters. If you love emotional sci-fi, tales, forbidden connections, and stories that stay with you, hit subscribe. It's free, and it helps us bring more stories from the stars to you." The docking bay doors of the station opened with unprecedented ceremony. Never before had the council chambers been cleared for a single human, but nothing about this situation fell within normal protocols. As the Wanderer's Hope settled into the docking cradle, its hull continued to pulse with that strange, beautiful, lighter rhythm that seemed almost like a heartbeat. When the airlock cycled open, Jake Morrison stepped out, and the assembled alien dignitaries collectively held their breath. He looked older, certainly, but it wasn't the kind of aging that came from years. It was the kind that came from witnessing the birth and death of galaxies, from standing in the presence of forces that existed beyond conventional understanding. His eyes, once a simple brown, now held flecks of starlight that seemed to move with their own intelligence. When he smiled at the gathered assembly, several of the more sensitive species reported feeling a warmth that reminded them of home worlds they'd never seen. 7 years, he said, his voice carrying easily through the massive chamber without amplification. 7 years I've been gone from your perspective, from mine? He paused, looking out through the observation windows at the impossible fleet that had followed him home. I've lived through the rise and fall of civilizations, witnessed the birth of new forms of consciousness, and learned that the universe is far stranger and more wonderful than any of us imagined. Chancellor Vex found his voice, though it still trembled. Commander, we need to understand what's happening. These ships, these beings, are they a threat to the known galaxy? Jake's expression grew serious, but not grave. A threat? No, Chancellor, they're refugees. And I'm afraid the danger they're fleeing is heading straight for us. The Council's emergency session convened within the hour. Representatives from 47 different species gathering in the great amphitheater that hadn't seen such urgency since the Void Wars 3 centuries past. Jake Morrison stood at the center, no longer requiring the translation matrix that had once been necessary for human-alien communication. Somehow and possibly, every being present understood him perfectly. The deep dark isn't what we thought it was, Jake began, his words causing ripples of unease throughout the assembled crowd. We always assumed it was empty space, a void between galaxies where nothing could survive. We were wrong. It's not empty, it's full of universes. The Centaurian ambassador, a being of pure crystallized thought, pulsed with skeptical energy. Impossible. Our greatest physicists have studied the deep dark for millennia. It's quantum vacuum, devoid of matter or energy signatures. Jake smiled, and that strange starlight in his eyes grew brighter. That's because you were looking for matter and energy as you understand them. The deep dark operates on principles that transcend our conventional physics. It's not just space between galaxies, it's the connective tissue between entire dimensional frameworks. He gestured, and to everyone's amazement, holographic displays materialized in the air around him. Without any visible technology, the images showed cascading layers of reality, each more complex than the last, folding and unfolding in patterns that made several attendees dizzy. When I entered the deep dark 7 years ago, my ship was translated, converted into something that could exist in multiple dimensional states simultaneously. I became an explorer of not just space, but of the infinite variations of reality itself. The Aquarian delegate, her bioluminescent tentacles flickering with distress patterns, spoke up. You're describing parallel universes, Commander. Theoretical. Constructs with no basis in observable reality. Observable by whom? Jake countered gently. By beings locked into a single-dimensional frequency? I've walked on worlds where mathematics itself is a living organism. I've spoken with civilizations that exist as pure information, trading memories like currency. I've witnessed species that reproduce by splitting time itself. The holographic displays shifted, showing glimpses of impossible vistas, cities that grew like coral through dimensions, beings of living music who painted with sound, vast networks of consciousness that span multiple realities like neural pathways in a cosmic brain. Each universe I encountered was facing the same crisis, Jake continued, his voice taking on a weight that seemed to press against the listeners' souls. Something is consuming realities from the outside in, devouring the foundations of existence itself. The refugees following me, they're the survivors of over 40 different universal frameworks that have already been consumed. The silence that followed was profound. Chancellor Vex's scales had turned almost white, and his voice barely managed to form words. Consumed how? By what? Jake's expression darkened. By something that exists in the spaces between thoughts. In the pause between heartbeats. The survivors call it the unmaking, though that's just their closest translation. It doesn't destroy destruction, implies something was there to begin with. It simply unweaves the patterns that allow reality to exist. The hegemony's war leader, a being whose species had conquered 12 systems through pure martial prowess, leaned forward with interest rather than fear. "Can it be fought?" "Not in any way you'd understand combat," Jake replied. "But it can be resisted. That's why they followed me here. Not because our galaxy is particularly defensible, but because of something unique about humanity itself." The assembled representatives exchanged glances. Humanity was barely 2 centuries into galactic civilization, remarkable mainly for their adaptability and stubborn refusal to accept impossibility. What could they possibly offer against a force that consumed entire universes? Jake seemed to read their thoughts. Every species I encountered had evolved within their single-dimensional framework. They were locked into one way of thinking, one method of existence. But humans... He paused, and for a moment the starlight in his eyes seemed to dance with something almost like pride. Humans dream of being more than they are. We imagine ourselves into new realities before we have the technology to reach them. We write stories about impossible worlds, and then spend our lives trying to make them real. The holographic displays around him began showing images from Earth, children playing games that required them to imagine being different creatures, humans creating art that depicted realities that had never existed, scientists theorizing about dimensions they could never visit. In every universe I visited, I was asked the same question: how do you exist in multiple dimensional states simultaneously? The answer was always the same, because we never really believed we were limited to just one. A representative from the Philosophers Collective, a species known for their analytical approach to existence, raised a query. "You're suggesting that human imagination somehow transcends dimensional barriers?" "I'm not suggesting it," Jake replied. "I'm stating it as observed fact. Every human who enters the deep dark doesn't just survive the dimensional translation, they thrive in it. We become bridges between realities, capable of understanding and communicating with forms of existence that should be incomprehensible." The weight of his words settled over the assembly like a blanket of stars. If Jake was correct, then humanity wasn't just another species joining the galactic community. They were potentially the key to survival itself. The emergency session continued for 18 hours straight, as Jake Morrison revealed the full scope of what he had learned in the deep dark. The assembled representatives listened with growing amazement and terror as he described civilizations of living mathematics, beings who existed as pure emotion, and vast intelligence networks that spanned entire dimensional clusters. "The first universe I encountered was designated Reality Framework 77 Alpha," Jake explained, conjuring holographic displays that showed a cosmos where physics operated on musical principles. Their species had evolved to think in harmonics. When the unmaking arrived, it destroyed their reality by introducing discord into the fundamental frequency of their existence. The images were hauntingly beautiful cities that sang themselves into existence, beings of pure melody who communicated through symphonies that lasted centuries, and vast orchestras of consciousness that conducted the movements of stars. All of it ending in a terrible silence as the unmaking consumed their dimensional framework. "But some survived," Jake continued. "When I arrived, they were existing as pure musical forms, trying to find a new reality that could sustain harmonic-based life. They followed me because they sensed something in human consciousness that resonated with their own nature, our ability to find beauty in complex patterns." The Zephyrian consul, whose species was known for their logical approach to all problems, voiced the question many were thinking. "Commander, you describe these refugees as if they've abandoned their home dimensions entirely. But surely they could rebuild elsewhere in their own universal frameworks." Jake's expression grew somber. "That's the terrifying truth about the unmaking. It doesn't just destroy civilizations or planets or even galaxies. It consumes the very possibility of existence within an entire dimensional framework. Once it's finished with a universe, that particular configuration of reality can never exist again." The implications hit the assembly like a physical blow. They weren't just dealing with refugees from distant wars. These beings represented the last remnants of entire ways of existing. The second framework I encountered was based on crystalline thought forms. Jake continued, his holographic displays shifting to show vast caverns of living crystal that pulsed with intelligent light. The beings there existed as networked consciousness within geometric matrices. When the unmaking reached them, it introduced chaos into their perfect patterns, shattering their reality from the inside out. More images flowed, impossible architectures of living gemstone, minds that existed as faceted light patterns, and communication systems based on the resonance of crystalline structures. All of it reduced to fragments drifting in dimensional void. They survive now as information patterns, hoping to find a reality where geometric consciousness can take root. They followed me because human minds, alone among all the species I've encountered, can hold multiple contradictory concepts simultaneously without breaking. Chancellor Vex had been taking notes throughout Jake's presentation, but now his writing implement trembled in his grasp. How many frameworks has this unmaking consumed? In the time I spent traveling through the deep dark, I encountered survivors from over 200 different universal configurations. Based on their testimonies, the unmaking has been active for what we would consider millions of years, systematically consuming realities one by one. The mathematical implications were staggering. If each universe contained billions of galaxies, and each galaxy contained billions of stars, and each star system might support multiple worlds, the scale of destruction was beyond comprehension. But here's what truly concerns me, Jake said, his voice dropping lower. The pattern of consumption is accelerating. The unmaking learns from each reality it consumes, becoming more efficient at identifying and destroying the fundamental patterns that allow existence. And it's moving in our direction. The hegemony war leader leaned forward aggressively. How long do we have? Jake looked around the assembly, meeting the eyes of beings whose species represented the greatest civilizations the known galaxy had produced. Based on the progression pattern, I estimate we have perhaps 50 years before the unmaking reaches our dimensional framework, maybe less. The silence that followed was deafening. 50 years seemed like both an eternity and no time at all when considering the magnitude of the threat they faced. However, Jake continued, and something in his tone made everyone lean forward, there is hope. Every universe I visited shared one common factor: they had evolved within single-dimensional parameters. Their consciousness, their technology, their very existence was locked into one way of being. But the refugees I've brought with me represent something unprecedented. His holographic displays shifted to show the massive fleet still waiting outside the station. But now the images revealed details that hadn't been visible before, ships that seemed to phase between different states of existence. Beings who appeared to be simultaneously solid and energy, technology that operated on principles from multiple dimensional frameworks. They've learned to exist between realities, to think in ways that transcend their original dimensional limitations. And they did it by observing human consciousness. We've become teachers, showing them how to be more than what they were designed to be. The philosopher's collective representative pulsed with intense curiosity. You're suggesting that human imagination has somehow infected these refugees with the ability to transcend dimensional boundaries? Infected is the wrong word, Jake replied with a slight smile. Inspired is better. You see, humans don't just imagine impossible things, we believe in them so completely that we make them real. When I interacted with these refugees, they began to understand that existence itself is just another limitation to be overcome. The assembly was beginning to understand the true magnitude of what Jake had accomplished. He hadn't just rescued refugees from dying universes, he had transformed them into something new. Something that might be capable of surviving even the unmaking itself. The revelation changed everything. Within hours of Jake's presentation, The Galactic Council's most brilliant minds were working alongside the refugee scientists, trying to understand how consciousness itself could be weaponized against an enemy that existed beyond conventional reality. Dr. Thane Kellum, humanity's chief xenobiologist, found himself at the center of discussions that would have been considered pure fantasy just days before. He stood in a hastily constructed laboratory where beings of living crystal shared workspace with entities of pure mathematical thought, all of them trying to reverse engineer the process that had allowed them to survive the unmaking. The breakthrough came when I realized something fundamental about human nature, Jake explained to the gathered research team. We're the only species that actively seeks out experiences that challenge our perception of reality. We write fiction about impossible worlds. We create art that depicts things that have never existed. We dream about being more than we are. Every human mind is essentially practicing dimensional flexibility every single day. One of the crystalline refugees who had taken the designation Clear Thought in Harmony pulsed with understanding. Your species uses imagination as a survival mechanism. You prepare for realities that do not yet exist. Exactly, Jake confirmed. And when I entered the deep dark, my mind was already conditioned to accept impossible experiences as potentially real, instead of breaking under the strain of existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously. I adapted. I became a bridge between different ways of thinking. The research team had been studying recorded interactions between Jake and various refugee groups, trying to identify the specific mental processes that allowed the transformation to occur. What they found challenged every assumption about consciousness and reality. Look at this neural pattern, Dr. Kellum said, projecting brain scans of Jake taken both before and after his journey. Before entering the deep dark, his neural activity showed typical human baseline readings, but now ... The second scan revealed something extraordinary. His brain waves seemed to exist in multiple phases simultaneously, creating patterns that should have been neurologically impossible. It's as if his consciousness is operating on several different frequencies at once, observed Dr. Lin Zhao, the team's quantum neurologist. Each frequency corresponds to a different dimensional framework, allowing him to think in ways that transcend single reality limitations. The implications were staggering. If humans could naturally develop this kind of dimensional flexibility, then humanity might indeed be the key to surviving the unmaking. But first, they needed to understand how to replicate and teach the process. The refugees have been studying human behavior patterns, Jake continued. They've identified specific activities that seem to enhance dimensional awareness. Creative pursuits, particularly those involving impossible or fantastical elements, appear to strengthen the mind's ability to process multiple reality states. This led to perhaps the strangest military preparation in galactic history. Within weeks, human artists, writers, musicians, and dreamers found themselves recruited as essential personnel in the galaxy's defense against an interdimensional threat. Across human space, creativity centers were being converted into training facilities where beings from dozens of different universal frameworks learned to think like humans. The process wasn't without its challenges. Many refugee species found human thought patterns deeply disturbing at first. The crystalline beings, accustomed to perfect logical geometries, struggled with the chaotic creativity of human consciousness. The harmonic entities, used to existence as pure musical forms, had difficulty understanding how humans could hold multiple conflicting melodies in their minds simultaneously. But slowly, amazingly, it began to work. We're seeing unprecedented results, reported Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had been assigned to monitor the crystalline refugees' adaptation process. Clear Thought in Harmony has begun producing geometric patterns that shouldn't be mathematically possible. When I asked how they were doing it, they said they were dreaming in human. The patterns exist because they believe they can exist. Similar breakthroughs were occurring across all the refugee groups. The harmonic beings were composing symphonies that incorporated silence as an active element, creating music that existed in the spaces between notes. The mathematical entities were developing theorems that solved themselves through creative intuition rather than logical proof. Most remarkably, these adapted beings were beginning to show the same dimensional flexibility that Jake had developed. They were learning to exist between realities, to think in ways that transcended their original limitations. "We're creating something new," Jake realized during one of the research sessions. "Not just refugees adapting to survival, but an entirely new kind of consciousness. A way of thinking that can exist independently of any single-dimensional framework." The refugee designated Song That Seeks New Harmonies, originally from the musical universe, had been observing human children at play through translation matrices. Their report was both touching and profound. The small humans create entire worlds through imagination alone. They inhabit these worlds completely, becoming whatever they wish to be. They do not question whether their imagined realities are real. They simply experience them as true. This is the strength we must learn. As the training programs expanded, something unexpected began happening. The humans working with the refugees weren't just teaching, they were learning as well, developing enhanced abilities to perceive and interact with multiple dimensional states. Artists began creating works that seemed to exist partially in other realities. Musicians composed pieces that could only be fully heard by minds operating on multiple dimensional frequencies. Writers crafted stories that changed based on the dimensional perspective of the reader. "We're not just preparing to survive the unmaking," Dr. Kellum observed during one of the daily briefings. "We're evolving beyond it, creating a form of consciousness that doesn't depend on any single reality to exist." But even as progress accelerated, Jake's monitoring systems were detecting ominous changes in the deep dark. The unmaking was moving faster than anticipated, and its approach was already beginning to affect the stability of their own dimensional framework. Time was running out, and they still didn't know if their unprecedented evolution would be enough to save not just their own galaxy, but the infinite possibilities of existence itself. The attack came sooner than anyone expected, beginning not with the dramatic arrival of enemy fleets, but with something far more insidious: the slow dissolution of certainty itself. It started in the outer rim systems, where patrol ships began reporting impossible sensor readings. Stars that had burned steadily for billions of years were flickering in and out of existence. Planets with well-documented histories were developing contradictory past events. Physical laws that had governed the galaxy since its formation were becoming negotiable. Jake Morrison stood in the command center of the hastily constructed dimensional research station, watching displays that showed reality itself beginning to fray at the edges. The unmaking hadn't arrived yet. This was just the precursor effect, the way existence destabilized when something from outside all dimensional frameworks approached. "Status report," he called out, though his voice now carried harmonics that existed in multiple realities simultaneously. The months of working with interdimensional refugees had changed him further, transforming him into something that was still human, but also something more. "Dimensional stability in sectors 7 through 12 is dropping rapidly," reported Dr. Kellum, whose own consciousness had expanded through contact with the crystalline thought forms. "We're seeing reality cascade failures across 15 star systems. It's as if the fundamental information that defines their existence is being systematically deleted." Around the command center, beings from dozens of different universal frameworks worked alongside humans and galactic species, their adapted consciousness allowing them to perceive and respond to threats that existed beyond conventional understanding. The harmonic entities sang stability patterns into failing star systems. The crystalline refugees calculated probability matrices that held dissolving planets together through pure mathematical will. The mathematical beings were literally thinking reality back into existence in areas where the Unmaking's approach had begun to erase it, but they all knew it was a delaying action. The real battle would begin when the Unmaking itself arrived. "Commander," called out Song That Seeks New Harmonies, their musical form now incorporating human emotional resonances that created entirely new types of harmony. "We're detecting the primary incursion wave. It's approaching through 17 different dimensional vectors simultaneously." Jake nodded grimly. This was what they had prepared for, an enemy that existed in the spaces between realities, attacking from directions that didn't technically exist. Traditional military response would be useless against something that could simply unmake the concept of resistance itself. "All stations, implement Protocol Impossible," Jake commanded. Across the galaxy, the most unprecedented defense in cosmic history activated. Human creativity centers, refugee adaptation facilities, and joint consciousness laboratories all began broadcasting simultaneously, not messages or weapons, but pure, imaginative potential. Every human child's bedtime story, every artist's impossible dream, every writer's fantastical creation was transmitted into the deep dark as a declaration of existence that refused to be limited by conventional reality. The effect was immediate and breathtaking. Where the Unmaking encountered this wave of creative consciousness, its approach slowed. Not because it was being fought with weapons or barriers, but because it was encountering something it had never faced before. Beings who could imagine themselves into continued existence, even when the fundamental laws that allowed existence were being deleted. "It's working," Dr. Vasquez reported from the Crystalline Research Station. "The refugee groups are maintaining dimensional stability through pure belief. They're not just surviving the reality dissolution, they're actively reimagining themselves into configurations that can exist independently of any single dimensional framework." But Jake knew this was only the beginning. The Unmaking was adaptive, learning from each encounter. Already, his sensors were detecting changes in its approach pattern, new strategies being employed to counter their unprecedented defense. Then the real attack began. Reality didn't just fray, it inverted. Up became down, past became future, existence became void, all simultaneously and contradictorily. The Unmaking wasn't trying to destroy their dimensional framework anymore, it was trying to make the very concept of their existence meaningless. This was when the true power of human adapted consciousness revealed itself. While every other species in galactic history would have been paralyzed by paradox, the human-trained refugees simply adapted. They held contradictory realities in their minds without breaking, existing as both matter and void, present and absent, real and imaginary, all at the same time. "We are what we choose to be," sang Song That Seeks New Harmonies, their voice somehow harmonizing with its own absence. "The Unmaking cannot delete what exists through choice rather than law." Clear thought in harmony, added their crystalline voice. "We think, therefore we continue." Logic is optional, will is eternal. Across the galaxy, an impossible sight unfolded. Humans and adapted refugees were literally thinking reality back into existence as fast as the Unmaking could dissolve it. But more than that, they were improving it, adding elements that had never existed before, creating hybrid possibilities that transcended the limitations of single-dimensional frameworks. Jake found himself at the epicenter of the battle. His consciousness expanded across multiple realities simultaneously, serving as a bridge between the various refugee groups and human defenders. Through his enhanced perception, he could see the Unmaking directly, not as an entity or force, but as an absence given purpose, a void that sought to make itself complete by consuming all possibilities of existence. But he could also see something the Unmaking couldn't: potential itself. "This is Commander Jake Morrison to all stations." He broadcast across dimensions that existed and dimensions that didn't. "We're not fighting to preserve what was. We're fighting to create what could be." Show the unmaking what it means to dream the impossible into reality. The response was magnificent and terrifying. Across the galaxy, human imagination merged with alien adaptation to produce wonders that had never existed in any universe. New forms of consciousness bootstrapped themselves into existence. Physical laws were rewritten through pure creative will. Reality itself became more flexible, more inclusive, more wonderful than it had ever been. The unmaking, faced with beings who could exist by choosing to exist rather than by following predetermined patterns, found itself facing something it had no strategy to counter, infinite, adaptive creativity. As the battle reached its crescendo, Jake realized they had done more than survive the unmaking. They had transformed it, offering it something it had never encountered, the possibility of becoming more than an absence, of choosing existence over void. In the end, the unmaking made a choice that surprised everyone, including itself. Instead of consuming their reality, it asked to learn how to dream. The universe would never be the same. And that, Jake Morrison reflected as he watched former enemies learning to imagine new possibilities for existence, was exactly the point. Humanity had given the galaxy something more precious than survival. They had given it the power to continuously become more than it was. The real journey was just beginning.